All right. Boy, this is really close. Maybe I better pull this aside. Can you still hear okay? Well, thank you all for coming. I have to start by saying that there was a mistake in the publication concerning the book. The title of the book is not Poverty in America. The title of the book is Poverty by America. And that preposition changes everything about the title of the book and the thrust of the analysis by Matthew Desmond, who is a sociologist, I believe, at Princeton. And I read the book because a number of years ago, Arnie Lerman started this book reading club here, and I got into it a few years back. And it's one of the more provocative books I've read in a long time. And the Buy America suggests that poverty doesn't just happen in America. It's a creation of our policies. It's a creation of our attitudes. And the chapter that I'm going to share with you, slightly edited because I wanted to cut it down a little bit for time constraints, is entitled How We Rely on Welfare. And in the process of this chapter, Desmond provokes us to rethink the term welfare and who gets it and who benefits the most from it. And so I thought it was a particularly important chapter. When the COVID-19 pandemic struck the United States, the economy went into a tailspin. Social distancing protocols caused businesses to shutter, and millions of Americans lost their jobs. Between February and April of 2020, the unemployment rate doubled and then doubled again, rivaling levels not seen since the breadlines and banker suicides of the 1930s. During the worst week of the Great Recession of the late aughts, 2008 to 2010, the worst week, 661,000 Americans filed for unemployment insurance. During the week of March 16th of 2020, more than 3.3 million Americans filed for unemployment. The country was in free fall. The federal government responded with bold relief. It expanded the time laid off workers could collect unemployment, and in a rare recognition of the inadequacy of the benefit, added supplementary payments. For 4 months at the beginning of the pandemic, unemployed Americans received $600 a week on top of their regular stipend, nearly tripling the average amount of their benefit. In August, the government reduced the bonuses to $300 a week, and in the summer of 2021, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce estimated that 1 in 4 recipients of the expanded unemployment insurance were receiving more from being out of work than they would have had they been working. Because of the generous unemployment benefits, alongside stimulus checks, rental assistance, expanded child tax credit, and other forms of relief, poverty did not increase during the worst economic downturn in nearly a century. In fact, it fell. The U.S. economy lost millions of jobs during the COVID-19 pandemic, but there were roughly 16 million fewer Americans living in poverty in 2021 than in 2018. Poverty fell for all racial and ethnic groups. It fell for people who lived in cities and those who lived in rural areas. It fell for the young and the old. It fell the most for children. Swift government action didn't just prevent economic disaster. It helped to cut the child poverty rate in half. I thought this would be a major cause for celebration. After years of inaction, the United States had finally made a major dent in the poverty rate. many people weren't celebrating. A vocal subset of Americans seemed troubled that the government was doing so much to help its own people. In particular, they blamed the souped up unemployment checks for the nation's sluggish economic recovery. David Rouser, a Republican congressman from North Carolina, tweeted a picture of a closed Hardee's with the caption, "This is what happens when you extend unemployment benefits for too long and add $1,400 stimulus payments to it." Kevin McCarthy, the House Minority Leader, wrote that unemployment insurance had demonized work, so Americans would become dependent on big government. The Wall Street Journal ran an opinion essay with the headline, "COVID Unemployment Relief Makes Help Impossible to Find." Reporters fanned out across the country and interviewed small business owners who attributed their hiring headaches to the federal government. We had employees who still chose to take the unemployment and not stay on, which I thought was just unbelievable, said Colin Davis, owner of Chico Hot Springs Resort in Montana. When did everybody get so lazy? During June and July of 2021, 25 states stopped some or all of the emergency benefits rolled out during the pandemic, including the expanded unemployment insurance. This created an opportunity to see whether those states enjoyed a significant jump in employment. It's what you'd expect if the benefits were discouraging Americans from returning to work. But there was no jump. When the Labor Department released the August data, we learned that in the race among states for the best job numbers, it was basically a tie. The 5 states with the fastest job growth, Alaska, Hawaii, North Carolina, Rhode Island, and Vermont, had retained some or all of the benefits. States that had cut unemployment benefits did not experience significant job growth. What they did experience was a decline in consumer spending, since the cuts left their citizens with less money to spend, and that slowed down their local economies. Other studies found no evidence that unemployment benefits were causing workers to stay home. And at the time, several European countries were also experiencing labor shortages, even though they hadn't done much to expand their unemployment benefits. Why, I wonder, did we so readily embrace a narrative that blamed high unemployment on the government when so many other explanations were available to us? Why didn't we figure out that people weren't returning to work because they didn't want to get sick and die? Or because their jobs were lousy to begin with? Or because they were tired of sexual harassment and mistreatment? Or because their children's schools had closed and they lacked reliable child care? When asked why so many Americans weren't returning to work as fast as some people would have liked, why was our answer, because they're getting an extra $300 a week? Perhaps it's because we've been trained since the earliest days of industry to see the poor as idled and unmotivated. The world's first industrialists faced the problem that titans of industry still face today: how to get the masses to file into their mills and their slaughterhouses to work for as little pay as the law and the market will allow. Hunger was the industrialist solution to the labor question. The poor know little of the motives which stimulate the higher ranks of people to action: pride, honor, ambition. In general, it's only hunger which can spur and goad them to labor. So wrote the English doctor and clergyman John Townsend in his 1786 treatise, A Dissertation on the Poor Laws, by a well-wisher of mankind, asserting a position that would become common sense, then common law, throughout the early modern period of the United States. The unremitted pressure of hunger, Townsend continued, offered the most natural motive to industriousness. Fast forward to the modern era, and you'll hear the same arguments. When President Franklin Roosevelt, originator of the American safety net, called welfare a drug and subtle destroyer of the human spirit, or when Arizona Senator Barry Goldwater said in 1961 that he didn't like how his taxes were paying for children born out of wedlock, and complained about professional chiselers walking up and down the streets who don't work and have no intention of working. Or when Ronald Reagan, campaigning for the presidential nomination in the late 1970s, kept telling audiences about a public housing complex in New York City where you can get an apartment with 11-foot ceilings, with a 20-foot balcony, and a swimming pool, and a gymnasium. Or when in 1980, the American Psychiatric Association made dependent personality disorder an official diagnostic category. Or when conservative writer Charles Murray wrote in his influential 1984 book, Losing Ground, that, quote, we tried to provide more for the poor and we produced more poor instead. Or when President Bill Clinton in 1996 announced his plan to, quote, end welfare as we know it, because the program created a cycle of dependency that has existed for millions and millions of our fellow citizens, exiling them from the world of work. Or when President Donald Trump's Council of Economic Advisors issued a report endorsing work requirements for the nation's largest welfare programs and claiming that America's welfare policies had brought about a, quote, decline in self-sufficiency. Or when Kansas Senator Roger Marshall in June of 2021 said that the number one impediment to his state's slack labor market was unemployment insurance that effectively meant paying people more to stay home than to go to work. In other words, America's medicine, aid to the poor, was actually a poison. The message has been received. Half the country appears to believe that social benefits from the government make people lazy. But it doesn't. The U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, the BLS, has meticulously tracked the spending patterns of families receiving means-tested government assistance. Not surprisingly, those receiving assistance spend a much larger share of their income on necessities, housing, and food, and a smaller share on entertainment, alcohol, or tobacco. The BLS also found that families with incomes in the top 20% of distribution dedicated twice as much of their budget to alcohol as families with incomes at the bottom 20%. It's been that way for generations. In 1899, the sociologist Thorsten Veblen wrote about rich people's taste for, quote, intoxicating beverages and narcotics, and the poor's enforced continence on account of the cost of booze and other drugs. We can examine how poor people respond when their benefits increase substantially. For example, researchers have recently evaluated the results of a universal basic income experiment that was carried out in Stockton, California. A random sample of 125 residents of the city's low-income neighborhoods were selected to receive $500 a month, no strings attached. So what did they do with the cash? Pretty boring stuff. They took it to the grocery store, or to Costco, or use it to pay utility bills, to fix up their cars. Less than 1% of the purchases were for tobacco or alcohol. We've We've also solid data on welfare dependency. Researchers set out to study the issue in the 1980s and 90s when when those issues dominated public debate. They didn't find much evidence for it. Most young mothers on welfare stopped relying on it within 2 years of starting the program. Most of those mothers returned to welfare sometime down the road, leaning on it for limited periods of time when between jobs or after a divorce. Some stayed on the rolls for long stretches, but they were the exception rather than the norm. Even at its peak, welfare did not generally function as a dependency trap. A review of the research in Science concluded that the welfare system does not foster reliance on welfare so much as it acts as insurance against temporary misfortune. Today, as then, the able bodied jobless adult on welfare remains a rare creature. According to one study, only 1 in 300 poor people in America are working age adults disconnected from the labor market for unknown reasons. If you dig into the data, you quickly realize that the problem isn't welfare dependency, but welfare avoidance. Simply put, many poor families don't take advantage of aid that's available to them. Only 1/4 of families who qualify for temporary assistance for needy families apply for it. Less than half, 48%, of elderly Americans who qualify for food stamps sign up or receive them. 1 in 5 parents eligible for government health insurance in the form of Medicaid and the Children's Health Insurance Program do not enroll. Just as 1 in 5 workers who qualify for their earned income tax credits don't sign up for it. Welfare avoidance persists through the bumper years as well as downturns. At the height of the Great Recession, 1 in 10 Americans was out of work, but only 1 in 3 collected unemployment. There's no official estimates of the total amount of government aid that goes unclaimed by low-income Americans, but the number is in the hundreds of billions of dollars a year. Consider the amount of money left on the table by low-income workers who don't apply for the Earned Income Tax Credit. Roughly 7 million people who could receive the credit just don't claim it, collectively passing up $17.3 billion annually. Combine that with the amount of money unclaimed each year by people who deny themselves food stamps, $13.4 billion, government health insurance, $62.2 billion, unemployment insurance when between jobs, $9.9 billion, and supplemental security income, $38.9 billion, and you're already up to $142 billion of unused aid. The rest of us, on the other hand, we, members of the protected classes, have grown increasingly dependent on our welfare programs. In 2020, the federal government spent more than 2020, spent more than $193 billion on homeowner subsidies, a figure that far exceeded the amount spent on direct housing assistance for low-income families, $53 billion. Most families who enjoy those subsidies have six-figure incomes. Poor families, lucky enough to live in a government-owned apartment, often have to deal with mold and even lead paint, while rich families are claiming the mortgage interest deduction on first and second homes. The lifetime limit for cash welfare for poor families is 5 years. But families claiming the mortgage interest deduction may do so for the length of the mortgage, typically 30 years. A 15-story public housing tower and a mortgaged suburban home are both government subsidized, but only one looks and feels like it. If you count all benefits, America's welfare state, as a share of its gross domestic product, is the second biggest in the world, behind only France. But that's true only if you include things like government subsidized retirement benefits provided by employers. I'll get back to that in a minute because even though you get your retirement benefits through your employer, the reason they have those programs is they get to deduct all of those costs from their taxes. But we'll get back to that. Student loans and 529 college savings plans, child tax credits, homeowner subsidies, benefits disproportionately flowing to Americans well above the poverty line. If you put aside these tax breaks and judge the United States solely by its share of GDP allocated to programs directed at low-income citizens, then our investment in poverty reduction is much smaller than that of other rich countries. The American welfare state is lopsided. Our country's not divided into makers who can support themselves through work and takers content to eke out a small life on government handouts. Virtually all Americans benefit from some form of public aid. Republicans and Democrats rely on government programs at approximately equivalent rates, as do white, Hispanic, and black families. We're all on the dole. In her book, The Government Citizen Disconnect, the political scientist Suzanne Mettler reports that 96% of American adults have relied on a major government program at some point in their lives. Rich, middle class, and poor families depend on different kinds of programs, but the average rich and middle class family draws on the same number of government benefits as the average poor family. Student loans look like they were issued from a bank, but the only reason that the banks hand out money to 18-year-olds with no jobs and no credit and no collateral is because the federal government guarantees the loans and pays half of the interest. Financial advisors at Edward Jones and Prudential can help you sign up for a 529 college savings plan. But those plans' generous tax benefits will cost the federal government an estimated $28.5 billion between 2017 and 2026. For most Americans under the age of 65, health care insurance appears to come from their jobs. But supporting this arrangement is one of the single largest tax breaks issued by the federal government, one that exempts the cost of employer-sponsored health insurance from taxable incomes. In 2022, 2022, this benefit is estimated to have cost the government $316 billion for those under 65. By 2032, its price tag is projected to exceed $600 billion. Almost half of all Americans receive government-subsidized health benefits through their employers, and over a third are enrolled in government-subsidized retirement benefits. These participation rates, driven primarily by rich middle-class Americans, far exceed those of even the largest programs aimed toward lower-income families, such as food stamps and earned income tax credit. Altogether, the United States spent $1.8 trillion on tax breaks in 2021. That amount exceeded total spending on law enforcement, education, housing, healthcare, diplomacy, and everything else that makes up our discretionary budget. Roughly half the benefits of the 13 largest individual tax breaks accrue to the richest families, those with incomes that put them in the top 20%. The top 1% of income earners take home more than all middle class families and double that of all families at the bottom 20%. Today, the biggest beneficiaries of federal aid are affluent families. To benefit from employer sponsored health insurance, you need a good job, usually one that requires a college degree. To benefit from the mortgage interest deduction, you need to be able to afford a home. And those who can afford the biggest the biggest mortgages reap the biggest deductions. To benefit from the 529 plan, you need to be able to squirrel away cash for your children's college costs. And the more you save, the bigger your tax break, which is why this subsidy is almost exclusively used by the well off. But the rich pay more taxes, you might say. Yes, they do, because they have more money. But that's not the same thing as paying a larger share of the taxes. The federal income tax is progressive, meaning the tax burdens grow as incomes increase. In 2020, it was 10% for the poorest individuals, that is, with incomes below $10,000 a year, 24% for middle income individuals, those earning between $85,000 and $160,000 a year, and 37% for the richest individuals with incomes at or above $518,000. But other taxes are regressive, forcing the poor to hand over a larger share of their earnings. Take sales taxes. These hit the poor the hardest for two reasons. First, poor families can't afford to save, but rich families can and do. Families that spend all of their money every year will automatically dedicate a higher share of their income to sales taxes than families who spend only a portion of theirs. Second, when rich families do spend money, they consume more services than poor families who spend almost all their money on gas and food, which are subject to more sales taxes. The progressive design of the federal income tax is offset by the regressive nature of other taxes, including the fact that wealth in the form of capital gains is taxed at a lower rate than wages. When all taxes are accounted for, we're all effectively taxed at the same rate. On average, poor and middle class Americans dedicate approximately 25% of their income on taxes, while rich families are taxed at an effective rate of 28%, slightly higher, and the 400 richest families are taxed at 23%, the lowest rate of all. The American government gives the most help to those who need it least. This is the true nature of our welfare state, and it has far-reaching implications, not only for our bank accounts and poverty levels, but also for our psychology and even our civic spirit. Those who benefit most from government largesse, generally white families with accountants, harbor the strongest anti-government sentiments. And those people vote at higher rates than their fellow citizens who appreciate the role of government in their lives. They lend their support to politicians who promise to cut the government spending, knowing full well that it won't be their benefits that get the axe. Overwhelmingly, voters who claim the mortgage interest deduction are the very ones who oppose deeper investments in affordable housing, just as those who received employer-sponsored health insurance were the ones pushing to repeal the Affordable Care Act. It's one of the most maddening paradoxes of a political life. But every so often, policies that disproportionately benefit the non-poor are placed on the chopping block. When that happens, all of a sudden the invisible welfare state suddenly flies into view. In 2015, President Obama proposed to do away with the tax benefits attached to 529 college savings plans. But Democrats from affluent parts of the country immediately mobilized against his plan, fearing potential blowback from their constituents. The administration quashed the proposal the very next day after announcing it. What Democratic leadership understood was that if the federal government took away 529 benefits or reduced the mortgage interest deduction or began taxing employer-sponsored health insurance, middle and upper middle class families would be outraged, which of course means those benefits aren't really quite so invisible at all. So how do we square this? How do we reconcile the fact that massive government tax benefits go unnoticed by middle and upper class families who claim them, which in turn spreads resentment among those families toward a government perceived to be giving handouts to poor families, which in turn leads well-off voters to mobilize against government spending on the poor while also protecting their own tax breaks that supposedly aren't even noticed in the first place. As I see it, there are three possibilities. The first is that many of us, understandably, have a hard time viewing a tax break as something akin to a government check. We see taxation as a burden and tax breaks as the state allowing us to keep more of what's rightfully ours. Psychologists have shown that we tend to feel losses more acutely than gains. The pain of losing $1,000 is stronger than the satisfaction of winning that much. It's no different with taxes. We're apt to think much more about the taxes we have to pay, the loss, than about the money delivered to us through tax breaks, the gain. This is by design, the result of the United States intentionally making tax filing exasperating and time-consuming. In Japan, Great Britain, Estonia, the Netherlands, and several other countries, citizens don't file taxes. The government does it automatically. In those countries, taxpayers check the government's math, sign the form, and mail it back in. The process can be completed in a matter of minutes, and more importantly, it better ensures that citizens pay the taxes they owe and receive the benefits owed them. If Japanese or Dutch taxpayers believe their government has overcharged them, they can appeal their bill, but most don't. There's no reason American taxes couldn't be collected this way, except for the fact that corporate lobbyists and many Republican lawmakers want the process to be painful. Taxes should hurt, President Reagan famously said. If they don't, we may come to see tax paying as a normal, straightforward part of membership in society, instead of what happens that irksome time of the year when the government takes our money. This is a case where the packaging is just as important as the gift. And I don't doubt that the way benefits are delivered and taxes are collected affect how we see them. Paying taxes does hurt, and perceiving tax breaks as fundamentally different from government aid is easy to do, but it's magical thinking. Both welfare checks and tax breaks boost a household's income. Both contribute to the deficit. Both are designed to incentivize behavior, like seeing a doctor, Medicaid, or going to college, 529 plans. We could flip the delivery system to achieve the same ends, extending welfare to the poor by cutting payroll taxes for low-income workers, as France has done, while replacing mortgage interest deductions with a check mailed to the homeowner each month. The federal budget is a giant circle of money, a whirl of funds flowing to the state from the taxpayers and back to the taxpayers from the state. You can benefit a family by lowering its tax burden or by increasing its benefits. Same difference. With respect to the federal income tax, some people believe that middle-class taxpayers are carrying the poor on their backs. But let's look at the data. In 2018, the average middle-class family had an income of $63,900. And that family paid $9,900 in federal taxes after all deductions and received $13,000 in social benefits, social insurance benefits like disability and unemployment, along with $3,400 from means tested programs like Medicaid and food stamps. In other words, the average middle class family receives $7,100 more in government aid than it paid in federal taxes, a serious return on investment. So the claim that the middle class Americans are subsidizing the poor with their tax dollars and receiving nothing in return just is not true. But more fundamentally, looking only at the federal income tax is like counting calories by only recording what you eat for breakfast. When commentators focus exclusively on this tax to claim that the poor make up the non paying class because their tax burdens approach zero after the standard deduction and tax credits are applied, they intentionally ignore all the other ways that the poor pay taxes as well as all the ways the rich don't. So here's the bottom line. The most recent data compiling spending on social insurance, means tested programs, tax benefits, and financial aid for higher education show that the average household in the bottom 20% of the income distribution receives roughly $25,733 in government benefits per year, while the average household in the top 20% receives about $35,360 per year. Every year, the richest American families receive almost 40% more in government subsidies than the poorest American families. Given this, I suspect there might be something deeper at work. Another reason for our willingness to acknowledge the invisible welfare state, that middle and upper class Americans believe they, but not the poor, are entitled to government help. This has been a long-standing explanation among liberal thinkers that Americans' hardwired belief in meritocracy drives them to conflate material success with deservingness. But I don't buy it. We're bombarded with too much clear evidence to the contrary. Do we really believe that the top 1% are more deserving than the rest of the country? Are we really in 2023 going to argue that white people have far more wealth than black people because white people have worked harder for it? Or that women are paid less because they deserve less? Do we have the audacity to point to the housekeeper with her skin peeling from chemicals, or berry pickers who can no longer stand up straight, or the millions of other poor working Americans and claim that they're stuck at the bottom because they're lazy? I've worked hard to get where I am, you might say. Well, sure. But we know that untold numbers of poor people have also worked hard to get where they are. Even in our personal lives, we see people getting ahead, not because of their gumption and effort, but because they're tall or attractive, or they know a guy, or they received a fat inheritance. A brilliant co-worker is passed over for promotion, while someone with dimmer lights is given a corner suite. A family falls on hard times after a gutting medical diagnosis or a car crash. Our lives are tangibly impacted in countless ways, not only by things beyond our control, but also by the relentless irrationality of the world. Every day we confront the capriciousness of life, the unfair, stupid ways our future is determined by background or chance. This brings us to the third possible explanation for why we accept the current state of affairs. We like it. It's the rudest explanation, I know, which is probably why we cloak it behind all sorts of justifications and quick evasions. But as the civil rights activist Ella Baker once put it, those who are well heeled don't want to get unwell heeled. No matter how they came by their coin. Frankly, tax breaks are nice to have if you can get them. In 2020, the mortgage interest deduction allowed more than 13 million people to keep $24.7 billion. Homeowners with annual family incomes below $20,000 enjoyed $4 million in savings. Those with annual incomes above $200,000 enjoyed $15.5 billion in savings. Also in 2020, more than 11 million taxpayers deducted interest on their student loans, saving low-income borrowers $12 million, and those with incomes between $100,000 and $200,000, $432 million. In all, the top 20% of income earners receive 6 times what the bottom 20% receives in tax breaks. Money granted by bizarre government subsidies is still money, and once we have it, we prefer to keep it. Help from the government is a zero-sum game. The biggest government subsidies are not directed at families trying to climb out of poverty. They instead ensure that well-off families stay well off. This leaves fewer resources for the poor. If this is our design, our social contract, then we should at least own up to it. We should at least stand up and profess, yes, this is the kind of nation we want. What we cannot do is look the American poor in the face and say, we'd love to help you, but we just can't afford it. Because that is a lie.